You won't believe what happened to me last weekend, something that could have cost lives. It all started when my HOA decided to get a little too involved in my property. I've always kept my dock in tip-top shape, using it not just for my boat, but for other essential purposes. But when one particular neighbor, let's call her Karen, took matters into her own hands, things went way too far. One morning, I discovered that she had cut the fuel lines running from my dock. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, maybe a misunderstanding. But what she didn't realize was that those lines didn't just fuel my boat, they were powering Coast Guard vessels. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could she not know? But Karen wasn't just cutting any ordinary lines. These were critical lifelines. Without them, not only was my boat out of commission, but so were some of the vital vessels the Coast Guard uses to keep our waters safe. The worst part, I had no idea why she did it at first. Was it just an HOA dispute gone wrong? Or did she have something else in mind? Stay tuned, because what I found next is something you absolutely won't expect. I've lived in this neighborhood for years, and until recently, everything was peaceful. The HOA had always been a little annoying, but I never thought it would come to something like this. For context, my dock has been there long before Karen moved in. It's part of my private property, built to support my boat, and for the last few years, a few essential community services. The Coast Guard frequently uses the nearby waters for training, and my dock provides a secure fueling station when they're in the area. No one had ever had a problem with it, at least, not until Karen decided it was a nuisance. At first, I thought maybe she was just trying to make a point. You know, the usual HOA complaints about everything from the color of your mailbox to how often you mow the lawn. But this felt different. It wasn't a simple rule violation. The fuel lines were critical to the operations of vessels that protect our shores, and cutting them wasn't just petty. It was reckless. My mind raced as I tried to figure out her motive. Was this a personal vendetta, or was there something bigger at play? I had to know why she would sabotage something so important. But what I found out next shocked me to my core, and it raised even more questions. I decided to confront Karen about the fuel line cuts. Maybe she didn't realize what she had done, or maybe she had some kind of justification. Either way, I needed answers. I went over to her house, knocked on the door, and waited. She answered, her usual smug smile on her face, like she was expecting me. Before I even said a word, she told me, "I don't know what your problem is, but that dock is an eyesore, and it's not up to code." It wasn't the first time she'd mentioned my dock. In fact, she'd been vocal in HOA meetings about the unsightly structures along the water, including mine. But I never thought it would escalate to something like this. I tried to stay calm, explaining how critical those fuel lines were, not just for my boat, but for the Coast Guard. She shrugged, almost as if she didn't believe me or didn't care. "I did the neighborhood a favor," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. I couldn't believe it. How could she be so dismissive? I started to realize that her actions weren't just about the HOA rules or aesthetics. She seemed determined to make my life harder, and it felt personal. But there was something deeper, something off about her attitude. Why was she so focused on my dock? I decided to dig a little deeper, see if there was anything in her past that could explain this weird vendetta. What I uncovered made the whole situation even stranger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. I stopped in my tracks as I saw Karen standing at the edge of my dock, but this time there was another figure with her, a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, wearing a black jacket, and had a cold, calculating look on his face. They were talking in low voices, too quietly for me to make out the words, but their body language said it all. There was something covert going on. My gut told me this wasn't a simple HOA dispute anymore. This was something far more serious. I stood there, hidden behind a few trees, watching them. The man seemed to be gesturing toward the fuel lines, the very ones Karen had cut just days earlier. She nodded, her face tense and focused. Then they both walked toward the water's edge. I couldn't hear everything, but I saw them both looking out at the Coast Guard vessels in the distance. It was like they were planning something. I needed to know what was happening, but I couldn't let them see me. I quietly pulled out my phone and tried to take a picture, but just as I clicked the camera, the man turned around, his eyes locking onto mine. My heart stopped. I quickly ducked behind the trees, hoping they hadn't seen me, but it was too late. I could feel the tension building, knowing that whatever was going on, it was about to escalate. The last thing I wanted was for them to think I was onto them, but it felt like I was already in too deep. What were they planning? And why did they need to be so secretive about it? I stayed hidden for a few minutes, my mind racing. What were they up to? The man had definitely seen me, and Karen, well, she was still too focused on whatever they were planning to notice me ducking out of sight. My hands shook as I backed away quietly, careful not to make a sound. I needed to get back to my house and figure out what to do next, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small black car parked on the road just beyond my driveway. I hadn't seen it there before. Whoever was inside had clearly been watching me. My pulse spiked as I realized I wasn't just dealing with Karen anymore. This was bigger, far bigger, than I had initially thought. The man with her had to be connected to something dangerous, something I hadn't even begun to understand. Was Karen working with him? Or had I stumbled onto something much worse? I couldn't shake the feeling that they were trying to cover something up. I quickly ran to my house, locked the door behind me, and grabbed my phone to call the Coast Guard. But before I could dial, I received a strange text message. The screen was cracked, but the message was clear. "Stay out of this. We know where you live." My heart dropped. Whoever these people were, they had eyes on me, and now I was a part of something much darker than I had ever imagined. The walls felt like they were closing in. I had to act fast, but I had no idea who I could trust anymore. Every moment felt like it was leading up to something terrible. The stakes had been raised, and I was running out of time. What were they planning to do with the dock, and why was I suddenly caught in the middle of their game? I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my phone and called the Coast Guard, explaining the situation and urging them to come as quickly as possible. The text still burned in my mind. Asterisk, we know where you live. Asterisk, whoever these people were, they weren't just playing games anymore. As I hung up the phone, I saw a shadow move past my front window. I wasn't alone. I barely had time to react when I heard a knock on the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I peeked through the peephole. It was Karen, standing with that same smug look on her face. She wasn't alone this time either. The man from the dock was with her, and behind them, I could see two more figures approaching, both wearing dark coats. My stomach dropped. It was happening now, whatever asterisk this asterisk was. I opened the door cautiously. Karen wasted no time, her voice cutting through the silence. "I don't want to do this, but you've made it impossible. You should have stayed out of it. Now, you're going to regret this." The man behind her stepped forward, and I could feel the weight of his presence. It wasn't until he reached into his jacket that I realized what they were after. But then, to my surprise, he didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he handed me a small, sleek device. "Take this. The Coast Guard needs it," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. I stared at it, confused. "What is it?" He glanced at Karen, then back at me. "It's a tracker. It monitors the fuel levels and coordinates for all the vessels around here, including Coast Guard boats. You weren't supposed to find out about it, but now you have. It was never about your dock. It was about the information that runs through it." Before I could process what was happening, I heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching. The Coast Guard had arrived, and they were fast. But the shock didn't stop there. As the helicopters descended, one of the figures behind Karen raised their hands in surrender. "We've been tracking your every move," the man said, his voice barely a whisper. "And we're not the only ones." The device they gave me wasn't just a tracker. It was the key to a much bigger operation, one that even the Coast Guard hadn't fully realized was at play. Karen and her crew weren't just rogue neighbors. They were part of a covert network, controlling access to critical information on local waters. Their goal was far more dangerous than a few petty HOA disputes. As the Coast Guard swarmed in, Karen's group was arrested, and the truth started to unravel. But just as I thought it was all over, I noticed something strange. The text message I had received earlier didn't come from them. There was someone else pulling the strings, someone even higher up than Karen, and they weren't done with me yet. I had thought I was safe, but the moment I held that device, I became part of something far bigger than I ever imagined. The real battle was just beginning. As the Coast Guard took Karen and her crew into custody, I stood there, still processing everything. I had thought I was just dealing with a crazy neighbor trying to make life difficult, but I had stumbled onto a much deeper conspiracy. The tracker they handed me was part of a larger operation, one that involved not just the Coast Guard, but possibly other agencies. What they had been doing with that information was still unclear, but I had no doubt it was something dangerous. The police were involved now, and I was sure the full story would come out soon. As the authorities cleared the area, I couldn't help but feel a weight lifted off my shoulders. My dock was safe. The fuel lines were repaired, and the Coast Guard could do their job without interference. But I knew that this wouldn't be the last time I'd encounter these kinds of people. The real mastermind behind it all, the one who sent me that cryptic message, was still out there, and they weren't finished with me yet. I took a deep breath, looking out at the water, knowing that life had just gotten a lot more complicated. But I also knew one thing: I wasn't going to back down now. Whoever was behind this would be stopped. The stakes had never been higher, and I was ready to fight back.